Thank you. As the members of the CEPAC come back, we will get started in just a minute or so. So thank you. You can come on camera, but just stay on mute for a minute. Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to give about 30 seconds, but I'm just checking. It looks like all the CEPAC members are back. I'm hoping that Ms. Arnston and Ms. Felix are back too. Good. And I see Dr. Mackey, and not sure if Dr. Redland's back yet.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, good. Okay, thanks. Okay, why don't we go ahead, welcome you guys back, and Kat is signaling that she thinks that all the CEPAC members are back, and that's good because we're about to start talking about the evidence again, leading into our vote. So all CEPAC members, please just kind of make sure that you are still in the voting software package. If you have any issues, please let Kat or Azanta know as we start to discuss the evidence. But why don't we turn now to the votes, just to remember where we're headed here. Could we see the first voting question, please? Okay, so the first vote is going to be, given the currently available evidence, is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of belimumab plus standard induction therapy is superior to that provided by standard induction therapy alone? So we're going to ask this of belimumab first, then we'll ask about voclosporin. What I'd like to do is to invite Jeff to just briefly restate the findings of the evidence review and the rationale behind the clinical evidence rating that was given for this question. And please feel free to refer to the tables, Jeff, that might have the key tables from the report that are part of the evidence summary for the CEPAC. Jeff?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. So the tables you probably want to focus on are tables 5 and 6. Table 5 is a complete response, and the second and third rows are the results for the belimumab pivotal trial, BLISS-LN, and then table 6 has the adverse events in the BLISS-LN trial, which is the really the second row in that table. If you want more detailed results, you can also look at table 3, where the primary outcome, the PERR, as well as the CR and PR are noted, along with the odds ratios associated with them. But the bottom line is there was a modest improvement in complete response and PERR with Benlysta compared to placebo. There were no harms. There's a significant amount of uncertainty, mainly about the long-term outcomes. And so we gave it a B+. We felt like there was evidence of some benefit, potentially substantial, but a lot of uncertainty really about the long-term outcomes.
All right, thanks. And I'll remind, I know the CEPAC knows this pretty well, but I'll remind especially those watching, in ICER's evidence rating scheme, a B+ is not the grade that you would run home crying to your parents and you're not happy. Some people would be thrilled, obviously, with a B+, but it's the second, almost the second best rating you can get from ICER, because it means that we have moderate certainty that of at least a small net health benefit that could range all the way up to a substantial health benefit. It's just that the relative uncertainty at the current time prevents us from being very specific about whether it's a kind of a relatively modest or major health benefit. So with that on tap, I know we're going to have, I want to kind of script our time so that we have a lot of time to talk about the contextual issues and the potential other benefits, and then certainly the cost effectiveness and value aspects. But let me just open it up now. Clinical experts or patient experts, is there anything you'd like to add right now about the clinical evidence on belimumab before the CEPAC weighs in and with its questions and votes? Yes, Ms. Felix. Christelle. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you. I think somehow you ended up muted. Were other people able to hear her? No? Okay, I tell you what, Christelle, we'll come back, or if you can figure it out, go for it. But if not, maybe Azanta can reach out and help you. Yeah, I'm afraid we can't hear you. Okay, we will try to come back with great apologies. Any other comments from the clinical experts, or and you can either use the raise hand function or just shout out if you need to. Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just, just for everyone, I'm sure you're all familiar with this because of what you do. These are high quality, and it's not just because I participated in them. These are high quality trials that were rigorously conducted, and the data are what the data are, and they show a benefit over a standard of care. And I think that's undeniable when you start slicing and dicing the data, as we talked about, to look at subgroups of, based by patient ethnicity or race. It gets harder to interpret, but overall, in both drugs, I would say the same thing with Voclo. These are the type of data that are the prime mover of evidence-based medicine that we have today, the randomized, blinded, controlled trial that's multi-center. So at present, this is the very best we can do. And so I really do believe these data are accurate.
Thank you. All right, Christelle, let me see, were we able to get back to be able to hear you? Do you want to try again?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I was saying I was diagnosed in 2007, and either with nephritis first, then SLE, or kind of together. It was really a battle for me in terms of finding the correct treatment. And I was really, really interested because at the time that Benlysta was approved for SLE, I had really active disease. And my doctor was actually not very, she was very reticent in, prescribing Benlysta because of lack of data for Black patients and lack of data for nephritis at the time. But I was able to convince her to at least try as a treatment. And I've been on Benlysta, first the infusion, then the injection for 5 years, probably more than 5 years. And I really believe that it's a lifesaver, that it was able to get me to really, really low dose of steroids that I'm on now. So for myself personally, and as well for other people that I know who have been taking Benlysta, it definitely has clinical benefits from a patient experience.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Mackey, I think you wanted to jump in too, if you want to.
Yes, thank you. So I definitely agree with Christelle. It helps some patients quite a bit. And with Brad, that this randomized clinical trial is the gold standard for us, and how we'll use it in clinical practice will be determined. But I do think, and this was brought up before, that there are added benefits to Benlysta other than renal disease. Obviously, it works in non-renal lupus, and it does. There's a lot of evidence now to say that it prevents flare rates. and flares mean more damage, which Brad brought up earlier as well. And these are all benefits that go beyond what's reported in the clinical trial, I think.
Right. And we are going to stipulate that because it was acknowledged, I think, certainly in the report and in our thinking, we were focusing on belimumab for the lupus nephritis, but as you said, it has an indication for other elements of SLE. And yet the trial's not measuring those. We had to acknowledge that we were really focusing in on its value clinically and otherwise just for lupus. And so we are going to note that, though, as a significant, if you will, potential other benefit. It's not even potential in some ways, it's an other benefit of the treatment for patients. Okay, let's go ahead and take the vote on this one. I'm not seeing any hands, which doesn't surprise me too much for this question in particular. So why don't you please go ahead and vote. We have 13 voting members of the New England CEPAC today, so let's wait till we get there. And then we'll be able to show the results. All right. If anybody is having difficulty with the system, please feel free to unmask yourself and either ask for help or just let us know that we need to wait a bit. We should have one more, unless someone hasn't come back from the break, and I'm not going to probably be able to scan the list. We'll just wait a few more seconds. Is anybody not seeing the system light up with their vote? Okay, let's go ahead and show the voting results. Okay, we're going to be dealing with percents today, so we all get to do reverse math. I would say that's probably 12 out of 12. Am I right? Okay, let's go forward. Thank you. The next question is the same, but it's about voclosporin. Jeff, you've already pointed out the tables. Is there anything else you'd like to add? It's tables, as you said, 5 and 6.
No, I mean, if people want to get picky on methodologic things, we could get lost in it, but fundamentally, voclosporin only had a year follow-up versus 2, so that introduces potentially a little more uncertainty. It had a bigger absolute benefit compared to the placebo response, so maybe it appears a little bit better, but I think there's lots of uncertainty. The populations were different, so I don't even say that. Really no harm signal, so very similar to the prior, and hence the evidence ratings were the same.
Okay, thank you. You can let us talk about this. You can take down the slide for a sec if you wish. Why don't we, again, are there any additional comments about this voting question on voclosporin or questions from the CEPAC? Yes, Megan.
Yeah, so this brings to mind what I don't know it has been considered or not is the mechanism of action of these two drugs are so dramatically different. And belimumab takes a minimum of 4 or 5 months before you'll see an effect, whereas you'll see an effect of the voclosporin or very early on. And the gentleman earlier from Orunia brought this up, and that you really should see a response by 6 months. Maybe Brad will have a different number there, but you should see it early on. So I don't know how that affects how the analyses were done, that there's just a huge difference. And I don't think that having a shorter reporting period in the voclosporin study leads to more uncertainty about the short-term results. I think for both, we don't know much about long-term, but for short-term, I would take them is equivalent to the Benlysta. I'm sorry, belimumab.
Yeah, I was more referring to the long-term uncertainty and the fact that at least we had 2 years for Benlysta, but only 1 year for Lupkynis. So, but yes, I agree 100% in terms of evaluating the short-term outcomes.
Yeah, I think, and partly I thought we were going to end up in a debate around whether 1 and 2 years is short or long-term. I think after COVID, our sense of time all changed, but as Jeff said, that he was thinking mainly of the longer term. Yes, Brad, please.
So let me agree with Megan, and let me just add a couple little things. Both trials are really being conducted longer, as you all know. They all, both of them have long-term extension phases. So in a very responsible way, I think both companies are trying to increase our knowledge. So that's really one thing. The second thing I think is really important is that this was, when you really can't compare trial to trial because everything is a little bit different. But when you sort of, but our human nature is, we compare trials. And when you look at the Voclo delta, the delta, which is the difference between the placebo response and the placebo plus Voclo response, or the standard of care plus Voclo response, this is really the biggest difference that we've seen in almost all of our lupus nephritis trials. And I think what didn't maybe come out, the innuendo in the importance of a complete renal response, is that this is clinically the most important factor for determining long-term kidney health. And that's been shown over and over again in observational studies dating back into the 90s or even the 80s. And so the complete clinical response is really almost exponentially superior in terms of preserving renal function than a partial renal response. We like to say it's better to have some response than absolutely no response, for sure, but it's really a lot better to have a complete renal response than it is to have a partial renal response. And so the more people we can get into a complete renal response clinically, again, based on proteinuria and serum creatinine or EGFR, which are not the perfect biomarkers, and we're all working on biomarkers, or many of us are, that are better. This really is an important piece of data. And I think, there is a wealth of calcineurin data now available to us because the Asian studies show basically the same thing. And so I think, when we look at the mechanism of action, as was, Megan pointed out, this is a mechanism of action that is in fact effective. And yes, we don't have long-term follow-up data of safety with belimumab, but we certainly have long-term follow-up data from the kidney transplant and solid organ transplant. And so we know how to use these drugs effectively. So that's all I'll say.
All right, thanks. And we'll be coming back to some of these issues actually when we talk about the modeling, the complete versus partial response, those kinds of things. Okay, I'm looking, no other hands are up from the CEPAC, and therefore let's go ahead and vote on that question. Again, this is on voclosporin. Given the current available evidence, is it adequate to say that adding it to standard induction therapy is superior to that of standard induction therapy alone? And I am informed that we actually do only have 12 voting members, at least for the moment. So please go ahead and put in your votes. I'm not seeing any growth in the votes though, so I'm wondering if our system is stuck.
I just got kicked out of the system.
Is stuck.
Yeah. It says polling closed.
Yeah.
I have the option of logging back in. I don't know if that's helpful to the other CEPAC members. It looks like you can just log back in. Let's see what happens.
I did so, but the polling is still closed.
Yeah, it looked like the poll was prematurely closed. So maybe it can be reopened.
We will wait for the technology gods to weigh in on this, but I assume that they've, I think we're looking at each other because they needed to go offline to.
It's okay now. Now it's okay. It's back on.
It's back up now.
It's back up now. Okay.
We can't have a sunny day and technology that works, Steve. Don't do that.
Well, I think the outcome of this vote is so unknown that the suspense is killing me. So we're almost there. One more response and then we can, there we go. Thank you. Let's go ahead and see the results. And the proverbial, whoa, that was fast, 100%. Okay, so 12 out of 12 for both drugs. Excellent. Okay, let's move on to it, as I mentioned at the very outset of the meeting, important considerations that relate to contextual considerations and potential other benefits. Can you show the voting question, please? First, when making judgments of overall long-term value for money, which is where we're headed on this journey, what is the relative priority that should be given to any effective treatment for lupus nephritis on the basis of the following contextual considerations? So just before we see that voting question, again, just to highlight that these are contextual issues related to lupus nephritis and are not asking the CEPAC to judge anything about how effective either of these two treatments are, certainly not in comparison to each other in any way. So it's really looking at lupus nephritis as a condition. So the first voting question is, in terms of how much priority to put given this contextual issue, and the issue is the short-term risk of death for patients without treatment. This contextual issue is meant to capture certain conditions that might be rapidly fatal, and in which some people who put priorities on allocation of healthcare resources feel that this should be captured importantly in that consideration. So we're thinking about lupus nephritis. It's obviously, I'll just say it, it's not, it's a chronic condition, and there will be a question related to that, but it is not generally a short-term risk of death at the time of diagnosis. And so do any of the CEPAC members have any questions about their thinking on this contextual consideration regarding lupus nephritis? Jeff, I'm sorry, you had your hand up, but I doubt you had a question.
No, just if you want to look at the ICER team's evaluation of this, this is table 11.
Thank you. I'd forgotten that was in the evidence summary. Okay. Any questions about this contextual issue? Any comments? All right. Let's go ahead and take a vote on that question, please. All right. You've got now, obviously not just a yes or no or an up or down, it's A, B, C, D, or E. It looks like we need just one more vote. Okay. You can see the results. Okay. We've got, oh, thank you for showing the numbers. That's easier for me at least. All right, 4 votes for very low priority, 6 for low priority, and 2 for average priority. Okay, thank you. Let's move to the next question. This one again is very different. This one is looking at the magnitude of the lifetime impact on individual patients of the condition being treated. So another reason to consider relative priority is not just short-term fatality and loss of life, but what's the lifetime impact of a condition? Because again, some ethicists and other policymakers believe that we owe special priority to treatment, any treatment for conditions that have a very high lifetime burden of illness. So we heard, I think, wonderful testimony from Dina and Tony earlier today. I'd like to invite Kathleen or Christelle, if you would like to say anything more about your understanding of the lifetime impact of lupus nephritis on patients' lives. Well, Christelle, please.
Sure.
Go ahead.
When I was diagnosed at 18, just beginning college with so many goals and dreams that I've had, and lupus has definitely affected that from 18 up to now, and even affects how I think about my future from now moving forward. And in terms of, we've talked already about how it affects everything. It really does affect literally everything from, work, career, family life, social life, literally everything that I do, the way I prepare, my morning routine is affected. My day-to-day routine is affected. And so, when I look at everything that I didn't know at 18, compared to where I am now, I guess it really dawns on me that, I didn't really expect everything that was going to be coming up. And how much of an impact that the disease would have. I think a lot more patients diagnosed today are a little bit more aware of the impact. But today, I'm deeply aware of every single facet that lupus affects in my life.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And Kathleen, I know you wanted to weigh in as well.
Thank you. I'll be brief here because I really have more input on the contextual considerations. I reiterate everything Christelle said. We're cut down in the prime of our life. It drastically impacts our hopes, our dreams, our aspirations. We have no idea what to expect. I was finally diagnosed correctly 37 years ago and had been sick since I was a childhood. So by the time I was diagnosed, I had extreme organ damage. And there were very few rheumatologists to treat us in rural upstate New York. Long story short, the only reason I'm alive is because I became educated and empowered and did my own research and had the most amazing parents possible who supported me every step of the way, and now have an amazing husband. And not everybody with lupus is so fortunate to have the support system. I also knew enough to reach out to the local lupus organization and get as much support and information as possible, never knowing that I would eventually become disabled and this would be my baby. And I'm very honored to be here and would like to give you kudos for the patient participation at this meeting. It's been amazing. And I'll save the rest of my comments for the contextual considerations. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Okay. If anybody on CEPAC, I know Dr. Mackey would probably like to chime in, but I want to give you a chance. Also, there's similar questions coming up, so I want to make sure we have time for them. Forgive me, I'm trying to wield my paternalism with a gentle hand here, but I want to make sure we have time for some of the other discussions. Does the CEPAC, anybody on CEPAC have a question or a comment before we take this vote? Okay, let's go ahead and move forward then. So on this question about the magnitude of the lifetime impact on individual patients of the condition lupus nephritis, again, A, very low priority, E would be very high priority given that consideration. Please go ahead and show the votes. And we have, good, we have, I think it's the numbers, so 8 for very high and 4 for high. Great, thank you very much. Let's move forward now to the, actually we're gonna skip this one and just go forward to the more focused, if you will. So here we shift from thinking about lupus nephritis as a condition to thinking about the added clinical benefits of each treatment individually, and whether there are in some ways what we might call spillover effects, effects that are not captured in the clinical trials, maybe not even in the cost effectiveness model, but we want to be comprehensive in thinking about the broader impacts outside, if you will, some of these analyses. So the first is going to be about belimumab. What are the relative effects of belimumab versus standard induction therapy on the following outcomes that inform our overall judgment of the long-term value for money of belimumab? So if we see the first voting question, it's going to be about spillover effects for patients themselves. If you can go to the next slide. So we know we capture this in some way when we try to with the cost effectiveness model, but we want to think about the broader impact on patients' ability to achieve their major life goals, and that could be related to education, to work, or to family life. So we're thinking about the added clinical benefit of belimumab and its impact on that. Do we think it's a major negative effect compared to standard induction therapy, all the way up to a major positive effect? So we've already heard, and again, this overlaps to some extent with some of the things we have heard from the patient experts and the public comments. But let's quickly come back off screen. And if Dr. Mackey, I'm not sure if this is something you wanted to comment on specifically, but it's very related to the last question in a way, but this is focused on patients. We're going to ask about the effect on family and caregivers next. Anybody want to make a comment or ask a question? Kathleen, please jump in again.
Sure. And I want to say that this goes equally for both drugs. I don't want to say the same exact thing a second time for the second drug, but when I was in high school, I had missed so many days of school that I was in danger of not graduating due to New York State attendance requirements. And yet I was at the top of my class and was supposed to give a graduation speech. I literally had to stay in school after hours to meet the attendance requirement. Once in college, I had to take a semester off due to aspirin-induced hepatitis. At the time, that was a treatment for lupus, and they did not know that I was allergic to aspirin. And then once I was back, I developed polycerositis. and sepsis, pericarditis, and peritonitis from an overly aggressive steroid taper. I almost died and missed another 4 months of school. I am very proud and worked very hard to eventually get my degree, but it was difficult to say the least. Once I began working, a vicious cycle developed. For every 2 years I worked, I ended up on disability for a year. I was never making any headway. After 10 years and several career changes, I threw in the towel and won my Social Security disability. However, as a Colgate graduate, I felt like a failure, unable to work. The final insult was not being able to be a mother due to the toxicity of the drugs I had taken for decades and my inability to physically take care of a child. I had then been diagnosed with multiple autoimmune diseases. I do believe very strongly that both of these treatments have the potential to reduce inflammation, address symptomology, and disease activity with much less toxicity than up to the 60 milligrams of steroids I endured. I used to weigh 220 pounds. I have atherosclerosis in all of my blood vessels, avascular necrosis, and I have cataracts and glaucoma. And I would not wish steroids on anyone. I believe that these drugs both have a significant impact on improving a patient's ability to return to school or work and overall productivity versus the comparator, especially in the younger generation of people who haven't maybe been exposed to the toxicity of the treatments I endured, which many were not even approved for lupus. So I just want to end on, for those of us with lupus, every 2 steps we take forward, we take 1 backward. Not only does this drain us physically, but the emotional toll is absolutely devastating. Dreams and goals are always being reassessed. And some days it's simply a victory just to get out of bed, shower, and put on clean pajamas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think that was a very eloquent statement to the point on this question. Anybody have any other questions about their views on this they'd like to share before we, okay, I'm going to take that opportunity to go back to the voting question. All right, so thinking again about belimumab's added clinical benefit, how do we think it basically affects patients' ability to achieve major life goals related to education, work, or family life, from major negative effect to major positive effect, A to E? Go ahead and vote. Okay, let's see the results. All right, we've got 6, I can do that math, 6 major, 4 minor, and 2 no difference. All right. And just to be clear, I'm not going to dig into the weeds here, but sometimes people will vote no difference because they feel that this is already well captured in the cost effectiveness analysis, and they may be interpreting the question this way. So I would not necessarily interpret the votes for no difference as implying that they don't think that the treatments do affect these aspects of patients' lives. All right, let's go to the next question though. The caregivers are something that are not captured directly in the model. And so the cost effectiveness model, so we like to ask about potential spillover effects here. We certainly heard about the effects on patients. So maybe we could invite one comment perhaps on how patients and their families, and not just patients, but obviously families and caregivers are affected, and thinking about how these treatments, this one in particular, and its clinical improvement might affect caregivers. Christelle.
A lot of us patients, well, I wouldn't say a lot, but some of us patients are really fortunate to have families that are really very supportive and very dedicated to our care, and willing to make sacrifices for our care, which are sacrifices that we appreciate a lot, but we can kind of see it as a burden in a way as well. And because for a lot of us, during our sickest times, our parents or family, spouses have had to take time off of work or, change certain life goals as a way to make time and energy to care for us. So you know, when you look at somebody with lupus, their entire family is affected in a lot of ways. For example, when I was in the hospital, almost 6 months, my mom was in the hospital with me almost every day. So she has to not be working during that time. My youngest sister was 8 at the time. So I know it was a burden for her as well, because when I continued my recovery at home, she was taking care of me a lot of times at 8, 10 years old. My father, who had planned to take some continuing education classes, had to stop for a while, just so that they could make sure that everyone is focused on me. And that's something that I really appreciate, but it is definitely something that affects everyone around. And that's, you know, both people living at home with me and extended families as well. And it's a very constant thing that happens for a lot of lupus patients. So the I don't want to use the word burden, but the effect is quite high on families.
Thank you. I know that's hard sometimes to talk about, and I appreciate your sharing it with folks. I really do. So we've heard that commentary, and I think that should bring us back to the voting question. Okay, so again, we're asking about the relative effectiveness of belimumab, its impact on caregivers' quality of life and these other factors. Again, A from major negative effect up to E for major positive effect. And we already have all the votes. Thanks. Let's see the results. Okay, we have 3 major, 7 minor, I'm sorry, yes, minor positive, and 2 for no difference. All right, let's go to the last. I think we might have one more, but let's see. I know there's at least one more. This is on health inequities. I need to frame the language here a little bit. So what we mean here is that society has a goal to reduce health inequities, and we want to ask about belimumab's relative effectiveness, its added effectiveness, and its impact on society reaching that goal of reducing health inequities. And would belimumab have a major negative effect on our goal of reducing those inequities, or would it have a major positive effect? And in many ways, we've talked about the relative kind of proportion of patients with this condition in the US who are people of color. But I would want to turn back briefly and either ask Kathleen or one of the clinical experts or Christelle, I guess, any other perspectives on, from your perspective, on how treatments like this, like belimumab, would affect our society's goal of reducing those health inequities. Anything else you'd like to add from what's being said before? All right, Christelle, you're up.
I would say that it would help if patients are, if the medication's actually able to get into the hands of patients. So
we will talk about that. We will talk about that.
Okay.
The policy roundtable is all about how we do that right. Okay, let's go back to the voting question. And I think this has been a part of the conversation throughout the day. So in society's goal of reducing health inequities, would belimumab have a, again, major negative A all the way up to major positive E effect? And we'll wait to see the votes coming in. One more. Oops, I'm almost there. Everybody check your system again. One person's vote isn't being registered. So there it is. Thank you. Okay. That looks somewhat familiar to a vote I've seen. So I think we have 4 major, yes, 4 major, 6 minor, and 2 no difference. All right, let's see. The next question, I believe, allows us to vote on something that we've heard about, and it has been wrapped in, I think, to some of the earlier votes, perhaps, on patients' effects on their lives, their life goals. But it felt significant enough, in part because it seemed to be underappreciated in some corners of the world. And so we wanted to highlight this as a specific vote. So I don't think we're going to need to discuss it any further, but I would like to ask the CEPAC to vote on whether the effect of belimumab and its ability to help preserve kidney function and it's thereby improving the chances for patients to have children represents a major negative effect on its overall long-term value for money up to a major positive effect. Okay, thanks. Let's see the votes. Okay, here we've got 5 major, 5 minor, and 2 no difference. All right, great. Okay, in moving now to voclosporin, the same set of questions. I actually am going to suggest, but we'll be open to disagreement, that the discussion we've just had about belimumab will be relevant enough. It should be, in a sense, identical. In your thinking, you can judge whether voclosporin has more or less effect on the outcomes, but I think we've heard the terms, if you will, the input from the patient and clinical experts that we need to think through this. So let's go ahead and go to the first voting question, which is about the patient's ability to achieve their major life goals related to education, work, or family life. And again, thinking about voclosporin and what you heard earlier, I'm not hearing any immediate objections. Let's go ahead and vote. And we'll likely do the same for the other questions since we've discussed them. All right, let's see the results. Okay, I believe that's 5-5-2. Yep, 5 major, 5 minor, and 2 no difference. Okay, we'll go to the next question, which is about the caregivers. Again, the impact spillover effect on caregivers and their major life goals, etc. Please go ahead and vote.
Is there any way I could give a quick comment on this?
Oh, Kathleen, yeah, please. People are already voting. Why don't you? Well, but people can change their vote actually up until the time we close it. So, oops, there you go. I hope we can come back to it. Kathleen, that was you, right?
Yes, okay. I'm sorry.
No, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually had a story about caregiving that I think is directly related. My husband, after I got married, my husband became the caregiver. And my lupus negatively impacted his career over time, and he ended up having to take early retirement. I was receiving 5 to 7 hour infusions twice a week and then weekly for 8 years at the academic center where my treatment team is located, which is 1 hour and 20 minutes each way from our home in rural upstate New York. I am visually impaired and quite ill at the time, so needed both a driver and an advocate in my corner. He used up all of his family leave time, usually by mid-year, and it just became too difficult for him to run his educational center remotely. He ended up having to take early retirement. And this was directly because I was being infused regularly. And not that I think one drug is better than the other, but I really do think that you should consider that voclosporin is a drug that is an oral treatment. And the impact might be just a little bit different than an infusible drug. Although belimumab can be injected, yes, on caregivers, yes.
Got it. Thank you. That is a distinguishing point. Thank you. Okay, let's go back to the voting question then. And I think you can change your vote if you wish. Now's the time. There are 2 people who didn't get a chance to vote at all. And we now have, let me just give one more sec to see if people want to change their vote. And let's go ahead and see the result. Okay. We've got 3 major, 7 minor, and 2 no difference. The next question will be about health inequities. All right, and as we've previously described it and discussed it, I think you can go ahead and vote. Okay. There we go. Good. 4 major, 7 minor, and 1 no difference. All right, and now for voclosporin, we also have at least 1 extra vote. So I'm sorry, this is the same question about the having children as we asked for belimumab. So why don't we go ahead and vote on this one in relation to voclosporin's effectiveness? Okay, waiting for one more. Everybody check your phone or laptop again. We're just looking for one more vote to come through. There it is, thank you. Okay, that's 5-5-2. All right. 5 major, 5 minor, it's no difference. All right. And now I think we have, okay. So we are going to stipulate also in the report when we write up the description though, because Kathleen, what you mentioned about the oral feature is also, by itself, it has, for some patients, it'll have a potential other benefit that we will note. And I'll come back to it when we talk about clinical use in the policy roundtable. What we have now is about 20 to 25 minutes to talk about 2 votes on long-term value for money. So we can go ahead and show the first one. I think there's a long intro here, and I might as well read it because it asks a difficult thing of the CEPAC. Given the available evidence on comparative effectiveness and incremental cost effectiveness, and considering other benefits, disadvantages, and contextual considerations, what is the long-term value for money of treatment at current pricing with belimumab versus standard induction therapy? Now, before you start voting or before anything else happens, again, just conceptually, this is where we intend to signify that your vote on long-term value for money requires you to kind of integrate these disparate components, if you will, of value. We're not telling you which has most weight or how to weight them necessarily. We're going to talk about the cost effectiveness results again in a second. But if you remember from my introduction, this encourages you to think about how you want to look at those contextual considerations and other benefits, etc., as you kind of weigh the whole in your judgment of whether the overall long-term value for money is low, intermediate, or high. So we'll start by asking Lena if she wouldn't mind to just really briefly describing the results again of the base case. And this is where we're going to get to talk about other features of the uncertainty and other questions you might have about the cost effectiveness before we come back to take that vote. So Lena, do you mind just repeating briefly some of the key findings and pointing them to the tables in the evidence summary?
Sure. The base case results for belimumab are presented in the evidence summary in table 7, and you can see the incremental cost effectiveness ratio was 89,663 per quality adjusted life years. There is increase in quality of life, in life years gained, and equal value of life years gained for belimumab in comparison to the standard care. And the uncertainty around the cost effectiveness ratio is reported in the table 9 in lupus nephritis evidence summary. The second row, you can see the probability for belimumab to be cost effective with different thresholds.
And Lena, if you had to identify what you think are the 1 or 2 most important scenario analyses, I know they're not in the evidence summary, but is there anything you'd want to say from your perspective that you would want the CEPAC to think about in the most important, either univariate sensitivity kind of analyses or formal kind of scenario analyses?
Yes, since both sensitivity analysis, the sensitivity analysis we conducted around belimumab shows high probability for this drug to be cost effective. Different sensitivity analysis conducted show that if we consider the threshold of 150,000 per quality, the belimumab was still cost effective. Though with different scenarios we conducted, we can see that incremental cost effectiveness ratio, in most cases, it is increasing.
Okay. So base case of 89,000. Now the GSK company representative who gave public comment, and I believe he's on our policy roundtable later, His public comments seem to suggest that the model wasn't fully inclusive of elements that could benefit patients. Maybe he was referring more to the extra renal effects of belimumab on fatigue, perhaps, or other things. But did you have any reaction to his comment or others that came up during the public comment phase?
Indeed, our model, because belimumab is also used for systematic lupus, our model is not capturing additional benefits that belimumab may have regarding to treatment of systematic lupus, though because the drug is already considered cost-effective, in our analysis, we do not consider that this is a big limitation of our assessment. And besides, end-stage renal disease is, as we were advised by our clinical specialists, is still the main negative consequence for systematic lupus.
Okay, thanks. So as I open it up for questions or comments from others, I do have to make one quick editorial comment, which is, even though ICER does present its results and frames our value-based price benchmark usually in the 100 to 150,000 per quality or equal value of life year gain range, we know that different decision makers will sometimes prefer the 100,000 threshold for decision making, some even the 50,000, and some certainly may want to see results higher. So we do provide results up to 200,000 in the report. So just to make that clear. All right, questions from CEPAC, and let's take this in. And remember, we're going to talk about the same things related to Voclosporin. That's where the 6-month discontinuation issue will come up. But I see Rob raising his hand. Don't forget, you can use the raise hand function as well to get onto my radar. Might be an easy way, although I think I can see most of you as it is.
For some, just a note, Steve, the raised hand function disappeared for me. I don't know if that's
no, others. It did.
It did for me too.
Yeah.
Try clicking participants. Does it not?
No.
It doesn't show up anywhere. Okay, well then guess what? I will watch for people's waving hands. All right. I tell you what, Zoom is quite a package. All right, Kathleen, I see you, and oh, maybe Rob, you didn't have a question. You just
no, I do have a question.
Okay, so I'm gonna let Rob go first. Kathleen, I see you in the queue, and I will start to try to keep notes. Anybody else, you can start flapping your hands at me. I'll try to catch you. Go, Rob, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So Steve, could you help to orient us to a question around long-term value for money when we don't have any results that would suggest or that indicate that the treatments have long-term impact?
Sure. I would almost say that this is unlike, this is like almost every other situation that we've asked you to focus on, except in the rare cases when you've got the patient-centered outcomes within that short-term outcome range of the pivotal trials. So a lot of the trials will measure what they can. In this case, and I think Lena did an excellent job of describing it, there's a short-term model based on the clinical trial results. And then you kind of have to stitch onto that assumptions about how that affects progression to end-stage kidney disease and death based on longer-term population studies. Sometimes they are older, sometimes they are not in the same population, but you do the best you can to kind of put those two together. That always introduces uncertainty into how those short-term results translate out through time. But I also thought that Lena did a very good job of describing many of the assumptions and the rationales behind the choices that were made. But please feel free to prod back in those directions if you had a specific one or that you kind of wanted her to talk more about. But I think that in general, the goal is to give credit to treatments that their point is to have a long-term effect, and we can't penalize them because we don't have 10-year outcomes data yet. So in a sense, we do the best we can, we make assumptions. But I do know, and you know this too, that for some people, the relative amount of uncertainty will modulate their sense of the value. So some people will say the more uncertainty I have, the lower a cost effectiveness range I need as my best guess now in order to feel comfortable with that long-term judgment that I'm making. Not everybody approaches it exactly that way, but it's a common approach for many people. All right, great question. Well, maybe other people will have other questions, but I know Kathleen wanted to have something to say, so please go ahead.
I'll make it quick because I think maybe we'll be talking about steroid sparing at the roundtable too. I already told you how bad steroids were and how devastating they are long-term over decades. But I also like you to consider, and I think it applies to these two questions, the long-term use of corticosteroids and its negative effects also drives up the overall cost and can often be higher than disease-related medical costs. So any treatment that can diminish the use of steroids could reduce costs, improve quality of life, and be a blessing to us, definitely long-term. And I see the value of both of these drugs in the ability to reduce steroids and get rid of them totally, or at least reduce on long-term and the damage and the cost. Thank you.
Thank you. Lena, do you want to comment briefly on how the modeling team took that on board?
Sure. We incorporated the increments in utilities related to steroid use in the short-term model, and similarly we incorporated decrease in costs, and relatively this decrease in cost was quite small. The utility values we used from the published studies, and they were added for both the low-dose steroid use and the no steroid use. But because there are no quantitative data that could inform how these affect the disease in the long term, we couldn't add this to the model because this would only increase uncertainty around the modeling predictions.
So I think, right, the short term, well, what's interesting is that this issue of long-term steroid use is not just in lupus, as you know, asthma patients, many others wrestle with this. And your personal experience, as you said, drove a tremendous amount of your health problems and costs and other things as well. So we all need better long-term data on what happens for patients who have to take high-dose steroids in particular. But the model was able to add in a quality of life adjustment, but did not feel like we could make any kind of assumption on the cost effects. So if you will, you could imagine that that's something that would lean you towards thinking that this result might undercount the value of the drug to some extent, but it's hard to know by how much.
Maybe one thing I should add is also partially it is reflected in the quality of life used for health states, because if the patients that remain in active disease, they probably have higher dose steroids than those in complete response and partial response. And this is already captured in the quality of life values assigned to these health states.
So if you assume that that sounds like it's tilting against the value of the drug, Lena, I'd invite you to just mention briefly the assumption that you think tilts it most in the other direction. I mean, you always have to make some choices. And at least for me, it would be, to some extent, the fact that we tracked complete response and partial response as having the same benefits. Whereas we heard from Dr. Rovin earlier that there's a big difference. A lot of the epidemiological data, it's hard to distinguish. And so in a sense, it felt like we were giving a lot of credit to partial response that clinical experts might think was, in a sense, leaning over to give extra value to the treatment. Would you agree with that?
As I was mentioned in the presentation, the scenario that we used as a base case, we can consider as optimistic scenario. So the scenario that gives more benefits to the drug than any other alternative scenarios that we considered. And this in turn, uncertainty that was raised in the previous comment, that was one of the reasons why we conducted so many scenarios analysis that we presented. So yes, as Steve mentioned, the base case, our base case is quite optimistic scenario, and we considered multiple different sources to assess the long-term disease progression as well. And all other data sources that we could use would lead to drugs being less cost-effective than in the base case analysis.
Brad, you're either pledging your allegiance to the Cub Scouts or you have a question or comment. Oh, but you're on mute, sorry.
Okay, there we go. Just one little point maybe, and I know Lena took into consideration the cost of end-stage kidney disease, i.e. dialysis or transplantation. Just to make it really clear, that 120,000, which I think is fair, several years ago it was 80,000 per year, now it's 120. That's every year, right? So and I think even though that's probably correct for the dialysis procedure cost, et cetera, it really doesn't capture the entirety of the dialysis patient and the impact in the family, because a lot of our patients were talking about how this impacted family members and caregivers. The dialysis patient has to go to dialysis 3 times a week, which means transportation. So a caregiver has to be available for that, or they have to do the dialysis at home and a caregiver needs to be available for that. It disrupts every aspect of that family life in a profound way. And transplantation, although it's less expensive in the overall picture, it's way more expensive to start with because of all of the hospitalization and immunotherapies. And then the other real problem with dialysis end-stage kidney disease is these patients are often in the hospital for a variety of things that really are very, very costly, and costly in time and also actual expense. So that I would just think about that dialysis expense as the beginning expense of a very expensive lifestyle change that is permanent. And so each year a drug might keep you off dialysis is a cost savings of a tremendous amount of money. And I don't know how to quantify that. That's you guys' job. You're economic people. But, for those of us who take care of dialysis patients, it's profoundly expensive. So.
Got it. Thanks. All right. We're going to have a couple questions. I need to save some time for Voclosporin because there's separate issues there. So I'm going to try to be very quick. If you can help me by being really quick with your questions and comments, we'll be able to get through this. Jean, I see you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to remind us that we're talking about women at a very early stages of their lives. And often I think when we think of end-stage renal disease, it's often in the context of people much older. I'm sure that's factored into the modeling, but it's just my reminder to all of us. These are young women and they're in this for a very long haul. Anything we can do to put this off seems to me to have never mind, I won't stage my vote here.
All right, thanks. Okay, I am not seeing any other hands. I'm going to go ahead and ask for the vote. That will give us time to talk about Voclosporin. So we're back to Belimumab. We're back to asking you to integrate these different factors and features. The base case cost effectiveness was 89,600 and change. And you've heard the other discussion. Let's go ahead and move to the vote, which you are. Thank you. And we are already there. Okay. All right. So we have 9 high, 2 intermediate, and 1 low. All right. I will just pause for 1 second to ask if the person who voted low value, is that, I'm not going to ask you to unmask yourself. That's not the purpose. But if you might have mishit your vote because you're the only person who voted that, I just wanted to ask. And if so, would you like to change your vote? If not, it will go in the record books. Okay, moving forward. We're going to talk about Voclosporin. I'm not going to reread the question. Let's hear real briefly from Lena the results again, and then we'll have brief discussion and we'll move to the vote. Lena?
Sorry, I was muted.
That's right.
So for Voclosporin, I would refer to have a look in evidence summary on the table 8 and table 9 as well. And in the table 8, we can see that the drug cost was 215,000, and it was around 23% from the total costs. But Voclosporin did result to increase in quality adjusted life years, equal value life years gained, and life years gained as well. And this ended up with incremental cost effectiveness ratio of 149,000 per QALY. That is reported in the table 8. And in the table 9, we can see, similarly to Belimumab, different probabilities for drug to be cost effective with a different cost effectiveness threshold. With a threshold of 100,000, it is 11.3%, and with cost effectiveness of 150,000, it is 48.6%. And I would probably also refer to the sensitivity analysis and different scenario analysis that were presented earlier today, which basically similarly to Belimumab, except of course societal perspective, which decrease incremental cost effectiveness ratio, and the scenario analysis conducted with a treatment discontinuation for patients in active disease at 6 months and not 18 months as a base case model. All other scenarios, they lead to increased incremental cost effectiveness ratio than in the base case scenario.
Great, thanks. So this modified societal perspective finding is not in the table. It's $132,000 per QALY, for those of you who are looking at that as part of your thinking. Lena, do you want to respond? Let's get somebody on the record about the 6-month issue, since that has come up over and over again. Do you want to just describe briefly the input that we received and the rationale that led us to 18 months?
Yes, we got different suggestions on the duration of the therapies, and of course there is a high uncertainty around how long patients may be on treatment. We got suggestions that patients in complete response and partial response, they may be on treatment longer than 3 years that we used in the model. And because of we got also suggestions that patients in active disease, they may be on treatment shorter. And that's why we use we didn't want to use treatment duration less than 1 year, because this was the trial data. The trial was conducted in 1 year, and patients remain in the trial on the therapy during this 1 year. And we saw there is a certain additional clinical benefits as well for patients who remain on treatment from 6 months to 12 months. And we consider that keeping 18 months is kind of a midpoint between assumptions that patients may stay longer for those who are in complete and partial response, and that some patients in active disease, they may be treated shorter.
All right, so just to be clear, that's not a statement that we believe that the right amount of time to be on the drug is 18 months if you're not getting response, if a patient's not getting response. It's a way to blend the different treatment lengths between patients who are and are not getting benefits from the treatment. Brad.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of tie in with some of the things the patients have been saying. The Voclosporin trial, both the phase 2 and phase 3, really have provided us with, I think, very, very good evidence that you can use a far smaller dose of corticosteroids in the treatment of lupus nephritis successfully. And I think that has made to a major change in our guidelines, in which the new KDIGO guidelines will be coming out. We just sent them in for review to Kidney International, that we're recommending lower doses of steroids. And of course, you've heard from the patients that there's an immediate bad effect of steroids and then a long-term bad effect as the patients get older. So I think that's really important. The other thing I didn't get to mention with the whole idea of having a complete and fulfilling life is that you can use calcineurin inhibitors during pregnancy. Okay, it's one of the few immunosuppressive drugs that you can actually take during pregnancy relatively safely compared to the other ones. So to me, that also improves the quality of life, because I hope we never have to tell anyone that they should never have a baby again. It's my goal to get everyone who wants to have a baby to have a baby in my lupus clinic. So I think those are really important considerations when you're talking about sort of the global effect of a medication.
Thanks. CEPAC, would you like to If you can hold on just one sec, Dr. Mackey, thank you. But I want to make sure if anybody on CEPAC has questions about the modeling of voclosporin, either for the ICER team or for the patients or for clinical experts. CEPAC, anybody? Okay, I'm seeing Jean again. Yes, Jean.
Yeah, there in one of the tables there was a price at which the cost per quality would move into a more targeted range.
Mm-hmm.
Any comments about that?
It's probably best, well, the price that was used in the modeling, I'll let Lena comment on that, because there was publicly discussed net pricing from the company and it gets kind of complicated. So I was going to bring that up in the policy roundtable a bit. But Lena, why don't you go ahead and you can describe to us that, because well, actually, Jean, let me make sure, what is your question? Which price we used, or what other?
I'll wait for the roundtable. You know, Stephen, I always jump the gun on the roundtable.
No, it's all right. No, that's all right. Okay, Dr. Mackey, why don't you jump in then?
So I just wanted to clarify with Lena that if a different time frame was used for the voclosporin in the baseline or base case results, if it was a shorter, that would improve that ratio?
Yes, that is correct. If the treatment is considered as discontinued at 6 months for active disease, the incremental cost effectiveness ratio decrease, and it will be 122,000 per quality adjusted 5 years.
I think that's very significant, because I don't, right, Brad? I mean, if patients aren't getting better by 6 months, I don't think you'd continue.
No, I think we talked about this with the New England CEPAC anyway. You're exactly right. We have to feel comfortable with Voclo because it can cause kidney fibrosis on the long, or I don't know if it can or not. Calcineurins cause fibrosis on the long end, and on the short end in real life, if a therapy isn't meeting certain metrics by 3 months and 6 months, we really do need to change therapy so that we don't continue an ineffective therapy. So those are all little nuances of practice that I guess would be incredibly hard to model, frankly.
Dr. Mackey,
Alina, please go ahead.
I just wanted to add something that, yes, it decreases incremental cost effectiveness ratio, but we also get the comments that patients in complete and partial response may stay longer than 3 years, and this will increase cost effectiveness ratio. So the longer the treatment is assigned, obviously the higher will be incremental cost effectiveness ratio.
And a lot of this, as it comes out in the policy roundtable, I'll start you off with a teaser. We need to figure out how some of this gets translated into clinical guidelines to help manage, if you will, some of the variation that we might see out there. And we know we have top experts here at the table saying, oh, that wouldn't be reasonable to do, but we'll have to think about what's going to happen out there. And we'll ask the insurers what role they might play. So there'll be a lot to talk about there. Let's come back because we want to have a break before we do head into that policy roundtable, excuse me. So if there's nothing else from the CEPAC, speak now or forever hold your peace. Let's move back to the voting slide on voclosporin. You've heard the discussion, you've seen the results, and let's go ahead and vote. All right, that's it. Okay. Here we have 4 high and 7 intermediate and 1 low. All right, great. That concludes the voting, the official voting section of today's meeting. Thank you. We are a little bit behind time, but we are again going to be able to catch up. We are going to be able to take about a 13-minute break, and we will reconvene at 1:45 to welcome the additional members of the policy roundtable. And we will dive into some very interesting aspects of translating the evidence into practice, into pricing and coverage. So we'll see you at 1:45.